Good afternoon. Welcome to Introduction to Ethics, Chapter 5, Absolutism versus Relativism. The objective of this chapter is to acquaint students with the concepts and questions that pertain to one of the most meta-ethical issues. Is morality absolute or is it relative? Now, there are two extremes to this position. Absolutism, for instance, maintains that there are absolute truths, and especially absolute moral truths, to which all human beings must adhere if they are to be moral. Relativism maintains that there are no absolutes of any kind, which is interesting since that statement in and of itself is an absolute. So, a relativist is saying there are no absolutes. They've contradicted their thought process in the opening statement. But they maintain that there are no absolutes of any kind, but that everything, especially morality, is relative to specific cultures, groups, or even individuals. Now, normally, this particular section gets pretty lively, and we have quite a bit of spirited debate within the class. We're not going to be able to do that except when you post in the discussion sections, get it going. Now, I insist that we are kind to one another. I insist on civility, but don't hesitate to express your opinion on either of these positions. Um, the meaning of absolute. Now, absolute essentially means perfect in quality, complete, not limited by restriction or exceptions, not to be doubted or questioned, positive, certain, unconditional. We generally apply this word to supernatural being or beings, gods, to laws of nature, to propositions, to law and morality, and most importantly, to propositions, truth, and falsity. Absolute, again, means variously perfect, complete, or certain. Um, the problem here is the same problem that we've had with every lecture and every topic so far in our class. When we are talking about an absolute supernatural being, it's difficult to prove the existence thereof. Or the presence of absolutes, laws in nature, let alone natural moral laws. Later, we're going to be discussing, not so much in this lecture, but we will get to the idea of natural laws. And it's interesting. Here we say it's difficult to prove natural moral laws. The founding fathers of the United States absolutely believed in natural laws, natural moral laws. The rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are natural moral laws. They cannot be bestowed by a government because they're bestowed from a creator. They are bestowed, our founding fathers felt, from a creator God. They cannot be given, they cannot therefore be taken away. Natural laws. And yet, here Thoreau puts into his text, it's difficult to prove the presence of absolutes, let alone absolute natural moral laws. You can certainly question the idea of the existence of such laws, but it's interesting. When you do, you're actually questioning the foundation of our country. The meaning of relative. Relative essentially means there are no values that cut across all cultures and peoples that are not relative to the specific place or person in and by which they're held. Um, A relativist would say that values are relative to time, place, persons, situations, etc. No values are absolute or even independent of cultures and peoples. What is a relative bearing? If you're using a compass and you are using a relative bearing, What's an absolute bearing? Well, an absolute bearing is north, and all other bearings are relative to your position and to north. And so think of relative, I guess, in that aspect. It works for me, at least that way. Now, there are different types of relativism that we want to discuss. Um, so far from how I've presented this lecture, I make it seem that I am an absolutist. And to some point, I do acknowledge that there are absolutes. I do believe in absolutes. However, I think that relativism has a place within ethics as well. Again, as we are seeing so often, just as Aristotle said, truth is the mean between the extremes. The extreme positions, which say there are absolutes that everybody has to adhere to at all times, and then the relativist that says there are no absolutes. I'd say both of those positions at times can be difficult to maintain. So come into this with an open mind. Look at, for instance, cultural relativism, and there are pieces here that we can use when we are developing our own philosophies. But anthropological facts in support of cultural relativism, and I use facts in air quotes here. Studies by anthropologists reveal wide variation in customs, mores, practice, etc. Imagine that. Um, Anthropologists have discovered that people are different from culture to culture. Uh, Moral beliefs uh, derive primarily from culture, according to this idea. Studies of both primitive and modern cultures reveal an extreme variation in customs, manners, taboos, with their religions, moralities, daily habits, and attitudes. And the moral beliefs and attitudes of human beings are absorbed from their time, what is socially accepted or sanctioned within their culture. People in different cultures tend to believe not merely that there is only one true morality, but also that that one true morality is the one true morality. And, it's the morality that they hold. That's not surprising, especially when cultures have been isolated. But it's difficult sometimes when cultures are existing side by side. Now, anthropological facts supporting cultural absolutism. Um, Similar moral principles exist in all societies, such as those governing the preservation of human life, sexual behavior, the prohibition against lying, and establishing reciprocal obligations between parents and children. These are similar in all societies. All societies you can't say all societies and generally, but generally societies have a prohibition against murder. I can't think of a single society that says murder is okay. Now, at this point in the class, but this society, they're not saying murder is okay. Their definition of murder may be different from our definition of murder, but no society says murder is acceptable. Um, and then people in all cultures do have similarities. They have similar needs. Survival is a common need with all societies. We need to eat. We need to drink. Um, Sex is a common factor in all societies. Um, so Thoreau points out that it is a cultural anthropological fact that peoples have similar needs. I would ask, do they? Do all cultures have similar needs? And yeah, I can't think of, sure, there are some peculiarities among cultures, but in general, um, we have more in common than we have apart. There are a great many similarities in situations and relationships in all cultures, such as having two parents, generally of opposite sexes, competing competition among brothers and sisters, sibling rivalry, or as the Smothers Brothers used to say, sibling revelry. Um, I'm dating myself here. Most of you probably don't know who the Smothers Brothers are. Um, Participating in the arts, languages, religions, and family. And there are a great many intercultural similarities in the areas of sentiment, emotion, attitude, jealousy, love, the need for respect. It's interesting. Across cultures, a family is a family. Now, some cultures view things a little bit differently than ours does. For instance, the relationship between cousins and siblings, it's not even recognized because the relationship is so close in certain cultures. And so a cousin and a brother, the difference isn't even recognized. But we have a lot in common. Now, there are some criticisms of anthropological facts. Now, just because cultures differ about what's right and wrong doesn't mean that one culture is right, whereas another is wrong. And just because a belief is learned or accepted by a culture doesn't mean that it is true or false, or that truth is relative only to specific societies. Some things cut across cultures. Just because moral principles are similar in all societies does not mean that they're valid or absolute. Just because three people do or three cultures do things the same way doesn't mean that it's the only way or even that it is the right way or necessarily the wrong way. And even if people have similar needs, sentiments, emotions, attitudes, there's still the question of whether these should or shouldn't be satisfied. Just because there are similarities in cultural situations or relationships, it doesn't mean that these are the only morally correct situations and relationships extant, or that they're even morally correct at all. Evaluation of these theories, moral relativism, there is disagreement between cultures. And just because there is, doesn't mean that a particular belief can't be right or wrong. Because people and situations exist in certain ways or behave in certain ways tells us little about what should or even ought to be the case. It seems if absolutism is true, then relativism is false, and vice versa. This isn't necessarily the case. But if you, at this point, it certainly would appear to be. Let's talk a little bit about propositions. Truth applies to propositions that are meaningful statements describing states of affairs. Sometimes these are referred to in the study of logic as first principles. A state of affairs is an occurrence, an event, a happening. It's neither true or false. It either occurs or it doesn't occur. A state of affairs, that's what we're talking about. Now, propositions. A true proposition describes a state of affairs that was, is, or will be occurring. A false proposition describes a state of affairs that did not occur, is not occurring, or won't occur. Only propositions are true or false, never states of affairs. They either occur or they don't. But propositions are true or false. Are there any such things as absolute truths? That is the question. Thoreau, the author of the text, Dr. Thoreau, is an ethical relativist. And yet, he states that truth is absolute and not relative to belief, knowledge, person, place, or time, right out of the textbook. it's a semantic thing for Thoreau. Obviously, truth is true. By its very semantic definition, it's absolute. And he goes on to say, there are such things as mathematical truths. For instance, 2 plus 2 equals 4. 1 plus 3 equals 4. 3 plus 1 equals 4. And this is true whether you're in Beijing, Moscow, or Washington, D.C. Mathematics is mathematics. And so there are instances, according to Dr. Thoreau, when truth is absolute. Now, logically, if propositions are stated accurately, this will always hold true. Now, we may not know which propositions are true or false, but that really has nothing to do with whether propositions really are true or false. Now, there are different types of propositions. There are analytic propositions. Now, these are truths that are known to be absolute because we know the definitions and meanings of the word. For instance, a triangle has 3 sides. All triangles have 3 sides. If it had 4, it would not be a triangle. It would be, I don't know, a square, a rectangle, a rhombus, but it wouldn't be a triangle. All triangles have 3 sides. Logical truths, the law of non-contradiction, the law of the excluded middle, the law of identity. These are true semantically by definition of terms. An internal sense or intern state proposition is a proposition that we know to be true merely because we have the experience. We alone truly know our own internal states. For instance, I could say, oh man, I've got a headache. Now, I know whether or not I have a headache, but you do not know. It's true by experience. It's known only to the person making the statement for sure. It's existential. Don't you love that word? Existential. You sound so intelligent when you use it, but this is the meaning of the word, or a meaning of the word. Sometimes when I am substituting in the school district as a nurse, I will get kids that will come in, and the most common thing is, my tummy hurts, my belly hurts. I don't know that their belly hurts. I can't verify it. A temperature isn't going to show whether your belly hurts. And so I have to make a judgment. Is the student lying to me because they want to go home, or does their belly really hurt? Now, there are some times when that internal sense can become external. For instance, once I had a youngster come in and go, oh, my tummy really hurts. And I said, well, really, did you just eat? And he said, "Wah!" And he threw up all over my feet. And it's like, now we have just changed from an internal sense to an external sense. And that would be how that works. Now, let's talk about an external sense proposition, an empirical proposition. Empirical is a fancy word that means true by evidence of the senses. An empirical proposition describes a state of affairs that occurs in the external world, of which we have evidence through our external senses. We have here the textbook for the class. Okay, I have evidence that it exists. You have evidence that it exists because it hurts when I thump it on my melon. You can see through your senses, through your eyes. You could hear that it thumped. There is a controversy in philosophy as to whether such propositions can be known to be true. But my own assumption is that some empirical propositions can be known to be absolutely true. Truth by evidence of the senses. Now, you know, Descartes, René Descartes said, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And he believed, he was a skeptic, and he believed that the only time you could be absolutely certain of anything was in an abstract sense when you were thinking, because your eyes can deceive you, your ears can deceive you. And yet, I do think there are some things that we can absolutely know to be true merely by evidence of our senses. No offense to Mr. Descartes. Um, Moral propositions. This is interesting because a moral proposition are propositions about morality or those that have moral import. For instance, human beings should never kill other human beings. Now, generally, these propositions contain words like should, ought, right, good, etc. Are moral propositions ever absolutely true? And further, can any human being know whether they are or not? Some philosophers state that moral propositions aren't truly propositions, and a proposition is true or false. These are emotive utterances, emotive theory, non-cognitive meanings. That is, they express feelings or attitudes. Now, if some propositions are absolutely true by virtue of logic or experience, are moral propositions ever absolute? Now, if we stick by the earlier statement that propositions are never true or false, or excuse me, propositions are true or false, states of affairs not so much. But if they are true or false, and emotive theory can't be proven to be true or false, how can we make an exception here? Some claim that morals are emotive. That is, they have no factual, rational basis. I would agree with that. I don't like the idea of a moral proposition. I do believe it's emotive theory, but I don't think that that is necessarily a bad thing. There are some problems with emotive theory. John Hosper felt that moral propositions have three aspects: the purpose or intention of the person who utters moral propositions, the effect the propositions have on their hearers, and the actual meaning of the propositions. If a moral proposition can have these attributes, then not all moral propositions are solely emotive. Emotivist theory exaggerates its claims. More, philosopher, had a naturalistic fallacy. If we say moral propositions are not any different from empirical propositions, we are committing the naturalistic fallacy. We are trying to get an ought from an is. Now, Moore, G.E. Moore, 1878 through 1958, states that a proposition such as "I will be angry if you steal my wife" can be considered to be factual. This is right out of the text, because it describes an actual state of affairs that will take place in the future. But it has no necessary connection to the proposition "you shouldn't steal my wife." Difficult to tie these statements together. Here's another one. AIDS is an STD and is a fatal disease. Therefore, people ought to practice safe sex if they don't want to get sick and die. While not completely definitive, it certainly makes sense. Now, moral propositions as types of empirical propositions. Now, these are empirical and rational in form. They are found in the larger class of propositions called empirical. Now, perhaps moral propositions are empirical propositions, but we've added value judgments to them. Now, there are some differing views. Moral statements are not propositions at all. They are merely emotive utterances. Again, this is my personal position. You can adopt it or not as you see fit. But moral statements are propositions, but here's another one, an opposing. Moral statements are propositions, but cannot be known to be true or false because they are not based on fact. Now, we are still confronted by the problem of matching propositions with the complexity of human thoughts, feelings, and actions. Now, to do this, we have to move from the concept of absolutes to that of near or almost absolutes or basic principles. This is where it gets interesting. This is where you've got the extreme positions that are coming closer and closer together, meeting more in the middle. Now, a basic principle, or near or almost absolute, is based on an absolute moral proposition. It should be adhered to unless some strong justification can authorize an exception to it. Perhaps this is the best that we can do. Aim for near or almost absolutes, making sure that we're able to justify all exceptions. We can say it's difficult to say a human being should never kill another human being. Now, in chapter 9, I think it's chapter 9, at any rate, we're going to be looking at taking human life. The value of life principle would be considered by most to be absolute. But are there ever any exceptions to this? And, under what that's what we would be looking for here. The best that we can do. Aim for a near or almost absolute, making sure that we are able to justify all exceptions. Now, are people relativists in real situations? Most will qualify this statement. What does the need to supply or add rules to relativism tell us? Our practical lives seem to conflict with our relativistic tendencies. And then the other side of the coin, there are absolutes in the sense of absolutely true propositions. From these, we derive near or almost absolutes that are either moral principles or emotive utterances that bear the weight of a moral principle. For instance, don't murder another human being. Murder is different from killing. Killing can be done in defense of the innocent. Murder is taking another human life for no reason. Now, or for the wrong reason. Each exception must be carefully justified. I know we blew through this very quickly. If you have questions, email me, call me, post comments on the discussion board, but you should be able to grasp this material. Read it carefully and then look at the slides in conjunction with this lecture, and I think everything should be fairly clear. Thanks. Have a great afternoon.